It's a smartphone video showdown for the ages!
But no, seriously, this is probably the most contentious fight in smartphone computing at the moment. And while the debate will continue to rage in terms of stills, comparing a 4-megapixel camera with a 13-megapixel camera, we can at least take a closer look at the video quality on both of these cameras as they both output 1080p HD video. So let's start off with a nice little flower macro. While I think all smartphone cameras have a tendency to overexpose, I was surprised to see that the HTC One actually had contrastier output in this scene. After comparing the HTC One to the Lumia 920, I was expecting the One to be more prone to blowing out the highlights. But in this example, it appears Samsung is actually the camera that's starting to lose detail in these white petals on these tiny little flowers. Both cameras are putting out a tremendous amount of detail. Although consistently throughout this test, I do think video off of the Galaxy S4 is ever so slightly crisper, retaining just a little bit more fine detail, and that's not necessarily because of the image sensor. All things being equal in terms of resolution, both cameras put out 1920 by 1080. The HTC One's wider angle lens means that more of the scene is going to occupy that resolution, which means when you shoot video from the same vantage point, the HTC One has an advantage in being able to see more scene, but the Samsung Galaxy S4 is going to have an advantage in retaining more detail within the scene. Now, playing around with stills and with videos, I find that the Galaxy S4 tends to output slightly warmer, slightly more saturated video. So these flowers represent an extreme challenge for a digital imaging sensor. A lot of these camera sensors have difficulty properly resolving the color red, especially when a priority has been placed on saturation. I mean, even SLRs can sometimes struggle to properly resolve and properly expose for the color red. So shooting a scene of all magenta flowers can be a pretty monumental task for a smartphone camera. And while I don't think the HTC One did a great job of exposing for this scene, I think it did a better job of retaining the detail and not clipping the reds in this shot. Moving on to a street scene. Now, this is an extremely aggressive, harsh, noonday lighting scenario, and this is really pushing each of these cameras' shutter speeds to the max. Seeing as how these cameras have fixed apertures and they're really wide apertures to help you with low light situations means that the shutter speed has to ramp up considerably to not blow out the entire scene. Just think about the movie Gladiator. When you see the shutter speed crank really, really high, it gets that really stuttery, jittery, edgy quality to the video. But this is one area where the optical image stabilizer in the HTC One does actually help smooth out video movement, especially with my shaky hands. It certainly does a better job than the non-optically image stabilized Galaxy S4. And putting these videos side by side, you can see the subtle priorities that each manufacturer has placed on their camera app. And one of those priorities is focusing. The Galaxy S4 is a little more conservative in how often it will re-establish focus, while the HTC One is really aggressive and can be kind of all over the place. Now, just for fun, checking out one of the more gimmicky features on both of these cameras, HTC has finally included a slow motion video mode. And while it's a welcome addition, it's definitely a lot of fun to play with. I think the slow motion mode on the Galaxy S4 achieves better output. Though, as both cameras have to downgrade the video to 720 by 480, neither of them are outputting quality that's worth writing home about. Now, here's a test that both the Lumia 920 and the HTC One both struggled with, that's shooting video while moving around. In this case, slowly walking forward while I lock my arms and elbows in place to try and be as steady a platform as possible. And no surprise, seeing as how the Galaxy S4 does not have an optically image stabilized lens, it doesn't fare as well as the HTC One. In terms of smoothing out the video, the HTC One's wider angle lens also comes with the additional benefit of just having more scene included on the video. So tiny little bumps or shakes are a little less perceptible just because we're seeing so much more information. Now, the GS4 does have a setting for electronic image stabilization, which basically takes a crop within the image to try and balance out some of the shaky movement. It's a totally software-driven approach to smoothing out smartphone video. And while it works to a degree, it definitely doesn't achieve the same level of smoothness that you can get with actual hardware image stabilization, and you still retain a jitteriness or a buzziness within the frame, which I don't think is very pleasant to look at. Moving into some indoor lighting, this microphone is being lit by the equivalent of 3 60-watt light bulbs, and those bulbs have a warm yellowish glow, which is kind of throwing the white balance off on the HTC One. This is kind of like one of those Canon versus Nikon fights that you'll often hear about when people talk about cameras. The Samsung Galaxy S4 is actually doing a better job of getting us closer to accurate white balance, but the scene actually did have a lot of yellow light in it, so the HTC One isn't necessarily inaccurate. On a scene like this, reality is somewhere in between the output of these two cameras, and that comes down to sort of a personal preference. An additional indoor lighting test just to show how extreme the crop on the electronic image stabilization can be on the Galaxy S4. Seeing as how the lens isn't as wide as the lens on the HTC One, and then you have to crop in to engage electronic image stabilization, you can see how much more of the scene is accessible with the wide-angle lens on the HTC One. And how when pit side by side, hardware image stabilization still tends to do just a slightly better job than software-driven image stabilization in smoothing out my jittery hands. Now onto an exposure transition test. Again, just like with focus, the HTC One's exposure adjustments are extremely aggressive. They're smooth. They're not like Windows Phone where they're stepped and kind of ugly, but they're very, very quick. Whereas the Galaxy S4 has a more pleasant blooming effect as you move from light to dark to light. One interesting aspect of the higher resolution image sensor on the Galaxy S4, as it's downsampling to 1080p, it does seem to have more of an issue with the rolling shutter, especially as you go across those bookshelves where they should be straight up and down, and they're starting to become diagonal lines thanks to the lateral movement. I won't spend a lot of time explaining rolling shutter. If you do a quick YouTube search or a Google search, you'll find many articles that can properly explain why that's an undesirable effect. And while there's still an issue with rolling shutter on the HTC One, in part thanks to the wider angle lens, I don't think it's as severe a problem as what we can see on the Galaxy S4. Now, this setup is an extreme example, and we're not really expecting either camera to do a good job here, but it's just to illustrate how in near total darkness, the HTC One is doing everything it can to resolve some kind of an image. It's scaling back to 20 frames per second so it can allow the shutter to remain open longer, that image stabilization is cranking, the ISO is high, and in the equivalent of about one candle of lighting in this scene, it's managing to pull a little bit more information out of the darkness. This is a scenario where the Galaxy S4's smaller pixel pitch not going to be competitive as we start getting into darker and darker scenes. And it really shouldn't come as a surprise that as we get into nighttime, outdoor, and street-lit photography, the HTC One continues its advantage here. While I still think the GS4 is maintaining a slightly higher dynamic range, the HTC One video is a little bit crisper, and movement within the frame tends to be a little less streaky. As an example of that dynamic range, in this scene, you can subtly make out the individual neon tubes in the video from the Galaxy S4. But when viewed as a whole, and again, thanks in part to that wider angle lens, I really do think that the video shot from the HTC One is just more aesthetically pleasing.
That is a good time to ask.
So weighing all the pros and cons, which one do I prefer? Do I like the Galaxy S4 or do I like the HTC One? Yep, it's that time, folks. And for as much as I genuinely do like the camera on the Galaxy S4, the subtle clarity and dynamic range advantages on the GS4 just aren't enough to counterbalance the myriad number of shooting scenarios in which having the wider angle lens paired with optical image stabilization on the HTC One are just going to provide better results. So, while the Galaxy S4 enjoys a significant resolution advantage when shooting stills, the HTC One is the Android phone I'd most want to reach for if I know I'm going to be shooting video. As always, folks, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you all on the next review.